Well, hey there. I hope you are doing well today. I want to talk about this really interesting, hard question that Exodus forces us to deal with, which is the idea of God's hardening of Pharaoh's heart. Because the question could be asked, you know what, if God hardened Pharaoh's heart, then who was actually responsible for Pharaoh's actions? And so that's a fair question, but with that question, we kind of have to go back to the passage and read exactly how it's constructed, because if we're not careful, we can miss some really important details. So first of all, when God talks about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, he does not talk about that until he has already talked about the fact that Pharaoh is going to resist. So in Exodus 3:19 and 20, we get indication of God telling Moses, hey, Pharaoh's going to resist. And then in Exodus 4:21, that's where God says, okay, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. And then he says it again in Exodus 7:3, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. So if God said that he would harden Pharaoh's heart, is Pharaoh really responsible? Because then you might go, well, how is that fair? Like, why does Pharaoh have to pay for his actions if God was the one determining what Pharaoh's actions were going to be in the first place? And so what's happening here? We need to be very careful, because in the first 5 plagues, the writer, Moses, the writer of Exodus, he's doing something very intentional here. In the first 5 plagues, God's not mentioned in the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart is talked about in 2 ways in the first 5 plagues. Number 1, it's saying that his heart was hard, or in some translations it says it was hardened. And when it says his heart was hard or his heart was hardened, what it's saying is not that anybody is doing anything to Pharaoh's heart, but that it's just making a statement about where Pharaoh's heart is at. So Pharaoh's heart was hard. That's simply a statement, which means it's really ambiguous as to who's doing anything to Pharaoh's heart. But what is absolutely clear in the first 5 plagues is that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. The writer goes out of his way to actually let us know God is not acting on Pharaoh's heart at this point. Like, Pharaoh is making his own decisions. He is absolutely responsible for the decisions that he is making, and they are all decisions to resist what God was trying to reveal to him in these plagues. So then, in the 6th plague, and in many of the plagues after that, what we see is that the position of responsibility for Pharaoh's heart shifts. So in the first 5 plagues, it was Pharaoh responsible for his heart. In the last 5 plagues, we see things like the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. The Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. And it keeps kind of repeating this pattern for us. And so what are we to take from this? Well, Pharaoh, it's interesting in the first 5 plagues. You even look at the very first plague, where the Nile turned to blood in an instant, like Pharaoh's economy, his entire country is crippled. And in that instant, what it sees is that Pharaoh, like the text goes out of its way to say Pharaoh, like, he turned his back and went into his house, and he did not even consider these things. So Pharaoh is clearly making decisions to harden his heart, to not deal with what God's bringing to his attention. And what's interesting is he had tremendous opportunity to repent, but he refuses to even consider it. And so then later, in plagues 6 through 10, what is clear is that God is actually the one hardening Pharaoh's heart. He's essentially giving Pharaoh over to the pathway that he's already choosing himself. So in some ways, Pharaoh crossed a line of no return. We could talk about it like that. Pharaoh refused to give any thought to the extreme evil and brokenness that he was reinforcing. And God was trying to bring this to his attention, and he ignored it. And so the point of letting us know that God hardened his heart is not to tell us that God was somehow constructing the evil intention that was inside of Pharaoh. That's not what the passage is telling us, but it's giving us a warning about becoming like Pharaoh. It's actually like helping to inform us as he's presenting Pharaoh as a negative example who time and time again chose to ignore what God was putting in front of him. And so then God responded to Pharaoh by finally cementing Pharaoh into the destructive path that he refused to acknowledge himself. And so the writer, he's making it clear Pharaoh is absolutely responsible for his evil. But at a certain point, God stops fighting him. God stops fighting him and actually begins reinforcing Pharaoh into the path that he's already going down. So what's amazing is that God is actually going to use this hardening to ultimately bring about justice against Egypt. Like he's going to use Pharaoh's evil purposes. He's going to use the hardening of Pharaoh's heart actually to bring about good things, to bring about justice against Egypt and freedom for Israel. Okay, so what? So what? What do we do with any of that? Well, number one, don't miss the fact that in the first 5 plagues, the writer goes out of his way to make it clear Pharaoh had plenty of opportunity to repent, plenty of opportunity to turn around, and yet time and time again he refused to acknowledge what God was telling him. And number 2, if you even ask yourself the question, gosh, I wonder if my own heart is that hard. If you even ask yourself that question, you are not Pharaoh. Like, I want you to hear me clearly on that. If you're even going down the thought of asking yourself the question of, I wonder if my heart is that hard, you are in a completely different place than Pharaoh was, because Pharaoh was not even considering these things. You're not ignoring it. It actually means that your heart is in a place where God has made it soft. And so seize the opportunity now and actually respond to him. Number three, I want you to understand that God is so merciful that he consistently repurposes what humans intend for evil for good. So what does he do? Well, he repurposes Pharaoh's evil. Pharaoh consistently hardened his heart. Yahweh stepped in and hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he used all of that to bring about his good purposes for Israel. I can look back at times in my own life when I made awful decisions. I made decisions from a hard heart. I made ignorant decisions, and God, in his graciousness, decided to repurpose the bad things that I did and turn them into some kind of good. Like, this is just how his mercy works. And so the final so what today, I just want you to know that God is so merciful that he repurposes, that he sometimes chooses to repurpose. This doesn't give us the excuse to walk into evil, but God is so gracious that he sometimes repurposes our evil for good. He brings about good from our evil. So Alliance Bible Church, I pray that this is helpful to you as you are thinking about these categories, and we're going to be addressing this question a little bit more as we continue on in Exodus, but I wanted to give some thought to it since it came up specifically this last Sunday. So thanks so much for joining me today, and I will have Autumn and Andrea back together. We're going to kind of do another family thing on Friday, so you can look forward to that video on Friday. Thanks so much for joining me.